Today is Tuesday, April 19th, 2019, and this is the regular weekly meeting of the Edina Morningside Rotary Club. My name is Dan Hunt, and I have the honor of introducing today's speaker, John Hinderaker. John is a native of South Dakota, where he honed his debate skills on the Watertown High School debate team under the tutelage of the nation's most honored high school debate coach, Donis Roberts. He graduated from Dartmouth College in 1971 and received his law degree from Harvard Law School in 1974. He spent 41 years as a litigator with Faegre and Benson and its successor, Faegre Baker Daniels, during which time he tried 100 jury cases and appeared in courts in 19 states, not as a defendant. Upon his retirement from the legal profession at the end of 2015, he became president of the Center of the American Experiment. John has a long association with the Center, including co-authoring several papers published by the Center and serving on the organization's board of directors, of which he was chairman from 1998 through 2000. In addition to his legal career, John co-founded the website Powerline in 2002 and has been a prominent voice on the Internet and elsewhere since. He has appeared as a commentator on NBC, CBS, Fox News, CNN, and CNBC, and is a frequent guest and guest host on national radio programs. John's talk today is Minnesota's economy really as strong as we think. Please give John a warm welcome.
Well, thank you so much for that nice introduction. I want to start by just thanking you for inviting me to be with you here today. My father was a Rotarian for something like 60 years. I gave my first talk to a Rotary group when I was 15 years old. That was over a half a century ago. And so I always feel comfortable when I'm talking to Rotarians. I feel like I'm at home. So what I'm talking about today is really based on a report that my organization, Center of the American Experiment, put out toward the end of 2018. It's authored by John Phelan, who is the organization's economist. He has an advanced degree from the London School of Economics. And this is the third year that we've produced this sort of report. It's basically descriptive, and it tracks the performance of Minnesota's economy using very standard metrics and very standard data sources so that we can look at the charts and graphs and see how we're doing compared to other states or to the nation as a whole. And one of the things that I observe when I talk to people in Minnesota and read the newspapers and so on is that I think most of us have the impression that Minnesota does very well economically, that we're well above average, that other states should really aspire to be more like us. And I think there are ways in which Minnesota is a wonderful state. Otherwise, I wouldn't have lived here for 44 years. And there are ways in which other states should aspire to be more like us, I think. But our economic performance actually does not mirror the image that so many of us have of it, and the image that, in all candor, I think we tend to get when we read the local newspapers. And so what I'm going to do today is basically hit the highlights of the report on the state of Minnesota's economy 2018 with some very basic charts and graphs, talk about them a little bit. There are more copies of this report on the table at the back there where you came in and picked up your badges. So if you want to get a lot more information, there's much, much more in the report that I'll be able to cover here this morning, and I'd encourage everybody to pick one up. Well, not everybody, because I didn't bring that many copies, but until they run out. And there are also a few copies of our quarterly magazine out there. We publish a magazine called Thinking Minnesota. It's free. That's the greatest thing about it. It's really quite good, I think. And it's a fun, colorful magazine. There are some of these on that same table in the back, so feel free to pick one up on your way out. If you like the magazine, everyone has got a card inside. If you tear off the card, it's postage prepaid. Just put your name and address on it, drop it in a mailbox, and you will be subscribing to Thinking Minnesota for free. So, the state of Minnesota's economy 2018. when you talk about economic statistics, really the starting point is gross domestic product, which economists calculate as the sum of the value of all of the goods and services produced in a country or a state or a metropolitan area or whatever it might be. It's really the most basic measure of the strength of an economy. And what our report does, basically, is to look at the 21st century. You'll see that in all these charts, that they generally will begin in 2000, and they'll go up through whatever the most recent data set is at the time that the report is prepared. And what you see here is that the GDP growth, starting in 2000, for the United States as a whole is the red line, and GDP growth for the state of Minnesota is the blue line. And what this chart shows is simply that by the most basic measure of economic performance, Minnesota is below average compared to the United States as a whole in the 21st century. I think a lot of people in Minnesota have the feeling that rural Minnesota, greater Minnesota, isn't doing very well, but the Twin Cities are really booming. And that really isn't true. You know, it's interesting. The areas in our state that are doing the best are actually located in greater Minnesota. And what our economist did here is that he started in the year 2000, once again, or 2001 for this one, and he identified the metropolitan statistical areas as defined by the federal government, the 6 next largest than the Twin Cities by GDP, and the 6 next smallest than the Twin Cities by GDP. So what we're looking at here is our peer group, the 12 metropolitan areas that are closest to us in gross domestic product. And so there's 13 urban areas on that chart, including obviously the Twin Cities. And what you see there is that the Twin Cities metropolitan area is actually near the bottom. And again, this is gross domestic product growth from 2001 through 2017. We finished 11th out of the 13 metropolitan areas. We beat St. Louis and Detroit. And what shocked me when I first saw this graph is to see that one of the urban areas that actually performed better than we did in the first 17 years of the 21st century was Baltimore. Well, what's in Baltimore? You know, not much that I know of, and yet their GDP growth in the current century has been better than the Twin Cities. So there are some measures by which we look good, by which Minnesota looks quite good. This is one of them. This is gross domestic product per capita in 2017, and you see all the states there, plus the District of Columbia. And you see the black line is the U.S. average, and the blue line is Minnesota. And so what that is telling you is that on a per capita basis, if you take the gross domestic product of our state and divide it by the number of inhabitants, 6 million or whatever that number is, you get a per capita income that's a little bit better than the national average. So that's good. We like that. That actually was GDP. Sorry, this one is personal income. And here, too, you see basically the same thing. If you look at per capita personal income, you'll see that we are slightly ahead of the national average. Now, when you look at per capita income, you always have to be very careful. Most people don't realize it, but the government's per capita income statistics include 3 components of income. One is labor, what you get paid as a wage or a salary. One is return on capital. And the third is government transfer payments. So welfare payments count, Social Security counts, cash received from the government is a component of personal income. And what this chart shows is that the fastest growing component of personal income by far is government transfer payments. That's true for the United States as a whole, and it is especially true for Minnesota. So when you look at per capita income numbers, you always have to remember that you're looking at something that it doesn't just include wages and return on capital. Now, so we just looked at numbers for GDP and personal income per capita in Minnesota and found that they were a little above the national average. But now look at this. This is gross domestic product per worker in Minnesota. And what you see here is that we are below the national average and below most states. So if you take that same gross domestic product for the state of Minnesota and you divide not by the total number of inhabitants, but by the number of people who have jobs, workers, employed people, we're actually below average in GDP per worker. And similarly, we're a little below average in per worker personal income per employed person. So how does that work? How can you be above average per capita, below average per worker? Well, obviously, those who have studied mathematics will yell out the answer in unison. The answer is you've got a lot of workers, and that's exactly correct. Minnesota's got some wonderful qualities, and one of our great qualities is that we really are hardworking. You know, I think we think of ourselves that way, and we should. This is a very hardworking state. You wind up a Minnesotan, fill him full of coffee, send him out the door, he'll go get a job. You know, it's true. This is labor force participation rate. The only state in the United States that has a higher labor force participation rate than Minnesota is North Dakota. And if you look at the states that are on top, it's really interesting. So many of these things are cultural, you know. If you look at the states that are on top, it's North Dakota, Minnesota, Utah, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Nebraska. The only state that breaks into that kind of upper Midwest tier there is the state of Utah. You know, so this explains why Minnesota's economy doesn't perform worse. We have a lot of people working. But what does it mean if you have way more than an average number of people working, but you have below average growth in your GDP, gross domestic product? Well, unfortunately, what that means is that Minnesota has a low productivity economy. The average Minnesota worker produces significantly less than the average American worker. Not the top American worker, but the average American worker. And this is a big, big problem for our economy, and it's something that our economist has written a lot about. And this is all from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You can slice this in different ways. This chart just shows private sector productivity for all private sector employment from 2000 to 2017. And as you can see, throughout that period, Minnesota has been significantly below average. I think it's about 8%. Significantly below average in productivity per worker. We also have these figures actually in the report for manufacturing workers and for service workers. And just in case anybody thinks that it might be a question of having too many part-time workers, that was the question I said to our economists. I said, wait a minute, that might just mean we've got a lot of part-time workers. Unfortunately, no, that's not the answer. They also have the data calculated on a per-hour basis. And all those charts look the same. Any way you slice it, we have below average productivity here in Minnesota. I don't think anybody knows that. If you were to walk down the street and ask Minnesotans, do you think Minnesota has a high productivity economy or a low productivity economy, I think 95% of us would say, well, we have a high productivity economy. But unfortunately, the reality is that we don't, and we haven't had for quite some time. Now, why is that? This chart is kind of complicated. And you have to study it a little bit. Again, it's in the reports. If you pick up a copy of the report, you could study it at your leisure. But with this chart, this chart shows two things. The blue bars signify the average GDP contribution per job in different sectors of the economy. And the reality is that while all jobs are good jobs, some jobs do contribute a lot more to economic growth, to GDP, than others. And you see that the jobs that on the average contribute the most to GDP are mining and logging, financial activities, information technology, wholesale trade, non-durable goods manufacturing. Those are the 5 bars the farthest to the left. The line that you see there shows Minnesota's net job growth or job loss from 2000 to 2017 in each of those sectors. And what that line tells us is that there are basically only 2 areas of the economy where Minnesota has actually seen job growth since the year 2000 in the 21st century. And those 2 areas of the economy are healthcare and education. Now, there's nothing wrong with healthcare and education. Those are jobs that we need. But in terms of contributing to gross domestic product on a per job basis, they are at the low end of the spectrum along with hospitality jobs. And if you look at the jobs that have the highest GDP contribution on the average per job, on the left side of the chart, you'll see that Minnesota has generally been losing jobs in those categories. And so I think that goes a long way toward explaining why it is that in the year 2019 we find ourselves with a below average productivity economy. I think another reason why we have a problem with productivity is that we lack capital investment. What this chart shows is capital per worker in the United States and in Minnesota. And it covers the period from 2000 to 2015, the most recent year when these data are available, in constant 2009 dollars. And what it shows is that throughout that period of time, Minnesota workers have had less capital behind them on the average than American workers. And again, we're not talking about the top American workers or the top states. We're talking about the average of all American workers. Now, this is a problem that's existed for quite a while. It doesn't look like it's getting worse. If anything, the gap has narrowed somewhat. But you can see it's not a one-year fluke. You know, it's a consistent pattern that we don't have the same level of capital investment in this state that most states do have. We're below average. And when I was much younger and less well-schooled in economics, somebody made a very basic point about capital investment to me by pointing out that a guy can make a lot more money with a backhoe than he can make with a shovel. And that's really what capital investment is all about. You've got to put capital behind your workers because that makes them more productive and it allows them to make a lot more money. This is venture capital per worker. This is a more dramatic difference between Minnesota and the country as a whole. You know, I'm old enough that I can remember when I came to Minnesota, we were kind of famous as a hotbed of venture capital. There'd be articles in the Star Tribune about venture capitalists in the Twin Cities and all the new businesses that they were helping to get off the ground. Those days are gone. And if you look at the trend, it's very negative. If you go back to the beginning of this century, we were just a little bit below average in terms of venture capital per worker. But over the years, that gap has widened. And you can see that post-recession, there's been a big increase nationally in the amount of venture capital in the economy. That increase has not happened in Minnesota, so that in Minnesota we've only got something like a third of the level of venture capital per worker as compared with the United States as a whole. So when you lack venture capital and you lack capital investment as a general matter, what happens? Well, one thing that happens is that you don't get as many new businesses starting up. New business formation is critical. We all know that. Because businesses have a life cycle. You know, nothing lasts forever. Businesses that once were the mainstays of our economy, companies like Sears Roebuck, you know, nothing lasts forever. And you always have to be starting new businesses to replace the ones that are in the later stages of their life cycle. And we also know that employment growth comes overwhelmingly from new businesses. New businesses are the big driver of job growth. So what this chart shows is that we don't have as many new and young businesses. This is as a share of all businesses compared to the United States as a whole. This covers the period 2000 to 2014. And that gap is actually growing. We're actually falling progressively behind the country as a whole when it comes to new business formation as a share of total businesses. Now, in my opinion, one of the problems that we've got in Minnesota that inhibits capital investment and inhibits the creation of good-paying jobs is very high personal income tax rates. And everybody knows this. There's no secret about it. But what this chart shows is the top personal income tax rate in all 50 states. I think there's 7 states that don't have a personal income tax at all. And so the blue line at the top is Minnesota. We've got the 4th highest top rate of any state. But the second blue line there is Minnesota's lowest personal income tax rate of 5.35%. That's higher than the highest rate in 23 states. So, you know, one way in which we obviously stand out is high personal income taxes. And then it's kind of a double whammy because in addition to having the high personal taxes, we also have high corporate income tax rates. We have the third highest corporate income tax rate in the United States. And our economist is working on a paper right now where he's going to try to really connect the dots and empirically establish the relationship between Minnesota's tax burden, which is somewhere around the fifth or sixth highest in the United States, and Minnesota's rate of economic growth, which, as we've seen, lags in a kind of a below average way. In 2016, my organization did a paper that got a lot of attention at the time. It was about income mobility, and it was based on IRS data. The IRS, just a few years ago, started putting out this massive database, which if you know how to work with it, you can extract a lot of information from. It tracks the movement of taxpayers around the country. And so you don't know their names, but you know where they started, where they lived, how much income they reported, and you know their ages. And so you can use that database to get very detailed information about people coming to Minnesota and people leaving Minnesota. And one of the points that Peter Nelson, who is the staffer who wrote that report, made that was really seminal, that it was a point that hadn't really been made empirically the way that he demonstrated it in that report, is that there are two sides to the problem. We hear about people leaving Minnesota. We all know people who have left Minnesota. There's no secret about that. They go to Florida, they go to Arizona, they go to Texas, they go to Tennessee. We know about that. But what we don't necessarily talk about so much is the people who don't come to Minnesota in the first place. And as Peter Nelson demonstrated in that 2016 paper, that is an equally important part of the issue, and frankly, it's probably even more important. It's not just that we're losing people who once lived in Minnesota, it's that we're not attracting the people who don't live in Minnesota. There's many reasons why people move from one place to another, family and weather and all kinds of reasons. But one common denominator is economic opportunity. If you have good paying jobs available, people will move to your state and take those jobs. And I think a fundamental underlying issue that we have is that compared with a lot of other states, we aren't generating the numbers of good paying jobs that are attracting people to pick up stakes, move another state, come to Minnesota, or that are attracting entrepreneurs. Maybe you're a business person, you started a business in Ohio, it's been successful, you've made money, you've figured out a system, you think you can open up a similar business in another state, and you start looking around, what state do I want to go to next? It's not Minnesota. A lot of states you consider, Minnesota's probably not going to be on that list. So what we have here is the net inflow and outflow of taxpayers and their dependents in and out of Minnesota by the income of the primary taxpayer over the period 2011 to 2016. The IRS is overdue getting this database out. They have not updated it since this. We're watching for it every day. It's going to come out. And when it does come out, we're going to update these numbers. But you hear a lot about the rich leaving Minnesota. I mean, that can happen. I mean, I could tick off a number of people who are wealthy who have left Minnesota. But what this shows is that Minnesota is a net exporter of people to other states at every income level over $25,000. We are a net importer of people from other states at the income level 0 to 25,000. Every income above 25,000, we lose more to other states than we gain from other states. So I'm a Minnesota booster just like most of you are. I love it here. I tell people how great Minnesota is. I want people to move to Minnesota. I want this state to thrive. I got 4 kids. I want them to live and work in Minnesota and have good careers here. But one of the things that we try to do in these reports is to present a realistic picture of how Minnesota as a state is really doing economically and how good a job we're doing of providing opportunities for that next generation. And I think the bottom line is that we really should want to do a better job, to make ourselves a more competitive state. So we have just a few minutes left. I'm happy to take any questions if there are some. Yeah.
Looked to me like agriculture was hardly mentioned in any of those statistics, and it might explain some of that. It wasn't even one of the sectors. There was a number in the Star Tribune a few weeks ago that agricultural income is cut to 20% of what it was 2 years ago. I'm wondering if you've had that same thought.
Yeah, I sure have. We're doing more and more work on agriculture, actually. I'm glad you mentioned that. Farmers are in these numbers. When you look at per capita income, when you look at GDP, they don't leave agriculture out. Farmers are in those numbers. There's a couple things going on. As you know, agriculture is relatively volatile. Commodity prices are up and down. It rains, it doesn't rain. There's an element of volatility there. And yet, when you look at these numbers over a period of time, that really is smoothed out. You don't see big ups and downs and say, aha, that's where the price of corn rose, And I think part of the reason for that is that we don't have that many farmers anymore. It used to be, half the population is farmers. Now, it's a pretty small number. But you're right. The farmers are in there. But I agree with you that we need more attention paid uniquely to the farm sector of our economy. In fact, that's something we're working on at my organization. We've got something we call the Greater Minnesota Project. I've got a guy hired who does nothing but tour around Greater Minnesota, meeting with people, setting up meetings for us like this all around the state, and talking to them about their issues, ag issues, small town issues. Yeah, it deserves more emphasis. Yeah.
I apologize. I couldn't necessarily read all the information on the screen. Was there one of those charts that you put up that was capacity utilization for the state, and if not, do you have a comment about that?
Are you talking about factory capacity utilization?
Utilization of capital, yeah.
No, I don't think that there is a chart that exactly says that in the report. You can skim through the report. I don't think there's one that talks about capacity utilization. One of the issues we've got, you may be aware that the most successful sector of Minnesota's economy, a lot of people don't realize it, but the most successful sector is actually manufacturing. Our manufacturing sector does very, very well compared to the nation as a whole. And it's scattered all over Minnesota. A lot of it's in Greater Minnesota. And when you talk to people who run or own or run, small and medium-sized manufacturing companies about their business challenges, almost all of them will tell you the number one challenge they've got is workforce. They could produce more, they could make more money if they could get a steady supply of trained, motivated workers who want to live in Greater Minnesota and work in manufacturing plants. And so one of the projects that my organization has going, we call the Great Jobs Project. And its purpose is to promote alternatives to four-year college degrees and to alert young people and their parents throughout Minnesota to the fact that there are many ways to make a very good living. It's not only the four-year college route. And a lot of people who go to work for manufacturing companies and learn to run the equipment, the very sophisticated equipment that they use nowadays, those guys make excellent money. And so this is a message that we are trying to spread throughout the state. And that's one thing that would help, to get approach closer to full utilization of some of those facilities. Yeah.
So I think it's interesting to see Minnesota compared to averages, particularly from New York or Mississippi. I think what would be perhaps more interesting is kind of thinking about it regionally. And so, do you guys break down those stats more, regionally specific? I got to believe that can tell maybe a similar story, or maybe a little different.
Yeah, the report doesn't do that. We've done that on our website. Our economist has looked at those kinds of numbers. A lot of people like to do comparisons between Minnesota and Wisconsin. We've done some of those. They're kind of iffy because you got an apple and an orange, You can compare us to the Dakotas, but of course there's obvious differences between us and the Dakotas. But let me just close by making one comment about that comparison. When I was growing up, I grew up in South Dakota. And when I was growing up, ambitious young people in South Dakota would come to Minnesota in search of economic opportunity. That flow has now been reversed. If you look at these IRS numbers, we are now a net exporter of people, and especially young people, out of Minnesota to South Dakota to North Dakota. Why are they moving to the Dakotas? It's not for the cultural amenities. It's for economic opportunity. So we do those kinds of comparisons. They're not really in the report, but if you follow our website, there's a lot more detail that we go into there. So anyway, thank you all very much. There's the report on the table. There's magazines on the table. Feel free to help yourself.